Welcome back to Unfair Housing. I'm Morgan Cardinal, and with me today is Alicia Magazoo. Thank you for joining us this week as we continue our discussion on realtors and real estate agents and their impact on segregating American neighborhoods. Last week, we discussed the influence of the Chicago Real Estate Board and the Los Angeles Real Estate Board on segregation. As previously mentioned, their practices and values also shaped the policies and practices of the National Association, which was founded in 1908 with the goal to unite real estate men of America for the purpose of effectively exerting a combined influence upon matters affecting real estate interests. In 1916, the National Association trademarked the term realtor, which was used to identify members of the organization. Contrary to what you might expect, most real estate agents at the time were not realtors, yet realtors controlled 80 to 90% of the real estate market. For instance, in California in 1920, realtors made up less than 2% of licensed real estate agents, yet that 2% controlled more than 80% of sales. So you can see the type of influence this group would have on housing, particularly as the number of realtors increased. Building trust was a key component to realtors' success in developing the market they wanted and controlling the lion's share of real estate transactions. Part of their trust building was establishing a code of ethics. The first National Code of Ethics was adopted in 1913. The code focused on honesty and providing the absolute best service in alliance with the best interest of the client. In 1924, the National Association required all local boards to adopt its code of ethics. It was also at this time it added discrimination practices to its code, stating realtors should not introduce members of any race or nationality into a neighborhood whose presence would destabilize property values. Shortly after, the National Association convinced 32 state licensing commissions to revoke the license of any realtor who advocated for integration, because to the National Association members, introduction of a Black American trying to work and send their kids to college was as harmful to a neighborhood as a criminal. Who do we have to thank for this point of view and language? The National Association's General Counsel, Nathan McChesney, who served from 1908 to 1947. Not only did he draft the language for the Ethics Code, but he was also responsible for drafting the language in the model racial covenant used by realtors across the country to keep Black buyers and renters out of white neighborhoods. This racially restrictive covenant's definition of a Black person, referred to as a Negro at the time, was equivalent to many Jim Crow definitions, which labeled a person having 1/8 or more of Negro blood and every person known as a colored person as a Negro and therefore unfit to live in a white neighborhood. So how did members of the National Association implement restrictions on integration in their ethics code and promote segregation across the country? When racial zoning became illegal in 1917 under the Buchanan decision, the National Association told its members they should stop integration by heavily relying on homeowners and neighborhood associations to segregate neighborhoods. They also pushed for the use of racial covenants and deeds that prohibited selling homes to Black buyers, following the lead of CREB in Chicago and J.C. Nichols and Duncan McDuffie. With the support of realtors, this practice led to nearly 75% of deeds of white-owned homes in major cities containing this restrictive, discriminatory language. Realtors' influence on segregation through the use of restrictive covenants and discriminatory neighborhood rules remained stated practice under the National Association's Ethics Code until 1950, when the code was changed to eliminate any mention of race or nationality. However, this new code did little to nothing to reduce realtors' discriminatory practices. This new code instead stated, realtors should not introduce any character or property use to a neighborhood that would destabilize property values. Of course, this change was praised by the National Association and its members as moving forward from their dark discriminatory past, but as we've discussed, realtors, investors, lenders, and most homeowners believed, without direct evidence, the mere presence of a Black homeowner would destabilize property values. So while the language of the code changed, practices did not. Realtors still refused to represent non-white clients. They removed homes from the market until they found a white buyer, and they even made sales contingent on the buyer being approved by nearby white neighbors. Not only did realtors have a great deal of influence over their members and the housing market, but also with legislators. This influence allowed them to create an exclusive club of real estate dealings that did not allow outsiders access to their inventory and allowed them to set their own pricing model, which is how the standard percentage of payment for realtor services, regardless of what service was provided, came to be. Before we talk about realtor influence in politics on a national level, we'll take a quick break. When we return, Alicia will discuss the National Association's opposition to fair housing laws.
Hey folks, Nicole here. We hope you're enjoying the Unfair Housing podcast so far. Thank you for joining us, and remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you'd like to schedule a fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. To see if you qualify for other legal assistance, contact the CLS helpline at 800-405-1417. And don't forget, give us a like and a follow, and please share the series with your friends and family. Also be sure to follow CLS on Instagram, Facebook, and X. You can also visit our website at legalaccessforall.org.
Welcome back. Like LARB, the National Association was adamantly against fair housing laws. By the early 1960s, several open housing laws had passed around the country. In November 1961, the National Association broke its silence and by 1963 had organized a response against the passage of local fair housing laws, which they viewed as a national problem. Unlike today, where we have symposiums to raise awareness for fair housing rights, realtors at this time organized symposiums to discuss forced housing. A leader in this effort was Alfred Avens, a professor at Kent Law School in Chicago, whose views on forced housing and opposition to fair housing were used by real estate professionals across the country. Avens did believe diversity and ethnic differences were beneficial to American society, but he also believed the only way to secure the true value and ensure the continuance of our differences was to segregate people on race and ethnicity. He was so convinced of his position, he adamantly argued the drafters of the 14th Amendment had no intention for it to be used to prevent segregation in housing and schools. Avens also championed the concept of individualism and freedom to associate based on race. Like LARB and Spike Wilson's led California real estate boards, he believed fair housing laws that gave minorities a right to purchase property wherever they wanted meant the equal right of the property owner to sell to whoever they wanted was taken away. The National Association championed Avens' viewpoint, stating, "We cannot gain one freedom by destroying another." The issue with this point of view is that by historically blocking Black Americans from being able to freely purchase property and locking them out of neighborhoods through zoning laws, restrictive covenants, home bombings, mob attacks, low pay, and so on, the exercise of freedom Avens discussed was heavily dependent on skin color and was completely controlled by one, white, which is what advocates for civil rights argued. No one should have the right to control the distribution of property, particularly in a way that necessarily excludes all minorities from access. You may recall the same was said by the Supreme Court in Shelley v. Kramer when racially restrictive covenants were struck down. The court reasoned allowing discrimination against a Black person to occur because a Black person may also discriminate against a white person is not the answer. But Avens' arguments were wildly successful among realtors and other like-minded thinkers. Their perspective was owning property was not a civil right, thus minorities should have no more privileges than those afforded to white property owners, and certainly they had no right to live anywhere in particular. Therefore, a buyer's right rested in the hands of the property owner, who holds the control over who will take over ownership of their property. From an equity perspective, realtors believed all were equal because the right that was afforded to all buyers was the ability to contract with a seller, should a seller be so inclined. A belief that very clearly on its face still puts a buyer's execution of freedom in the control of the seller. Since, at the time, white buyers had no interest in purchasing property from black sellers, this point of view did, of course, skew access to freedom to one side. Advocates for Avon's point of view coined the phrase compulsory integration to describe fair housing, which was the idea the government was forcing people to live together where they did not want to. Of course, nothing about fair housing laws required anyone to sell their home or relocate, but the narrative pushed about compulsory integration ignored this. Realtors also used the age-old argument fair housing laws were just the beginning of the government controlling where we should live, and thus had to be stopped before it got out of hand. Realtor influence didn't just reach legislatures and voters, but the entire real estate industry as well. Around 1939, there were 165 universities teaching courses on real estate, and they all taught students the unproven myth pushed by realtors: the presence of a black person in a neighborhood reduced surrounding property values by half. This position was basically taught as scientific fact in the real estate industry. It was also included in every real estate textbook and appraisal manual in the country, and, as we've previously discussed, was adopted by the federal government and incorporated as fact when developing housing programs. The correlation between realtors and the federal government has a very extensive past we don't have time to cover in its entirety, but there are certainly highlights worth mentioning. Perhaps the most profound influence realtors had in segregation in partnership with the federal government was through the development of the Federal Housing Administration and the programs it ran, particularly those under the New Deal. The National Association was tapped to partner with the FHA to both establish policy and provide staff to implement those policies. And while we may be able to thank the National Association for shaping the modern-day mortgage landscape by creating long-term lending structures with manageable down payments, we can also credit them with vastly contributing to the stark wealth and homeownership gaps between white Americans and minorities still present today. By the time the FHA underwriting manual was published in 1935, realtors had successfully led all real estate professionals and white homeowners to believe the myth that the presence of a black family in a white neighborhood will reduce home values. So the same myth was an easy sell to the federal government, which relied on the National Association-affiliated appraisers to assign value to FHA-backed properties. Realtors were also significantly involved in creating the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which you may recall from previous discussions implemented policy that redlined neighborhoods, separating white and black residents and color-coding perceived risk based on race. And while this information is openly known now, it wasn't at the time. The FHA kept both its manual and redlining maps out of the public eye. Realtors were, of course, privy to this information, in part because they helped develop it, including the redline maps, and in part because they used it to carry out their own agenda and further the FHA's discriminatory practices. It took the NAACP 4 years to figure out exactly what practices were being used by the federal government to exclude minorities from its programs, and the damage done by these exclusionary practices was vast. Between 1930 to the early 1960s, the FHA federally guaranteed 12 million mortgages, but only 2% benefited Black Americans, and the majority of that 2% went to finance segregated housing in the South. During this time, the National Association was also extremely critical of New Deal programs its members felt threatened private homeownership. So not only did the National Association control the terms of the federally backed mortgage program, but it fiercely lobbied against funding for public housing. In fact, it was the National Association that convinced Congress to require housing built for wartime workers to either be destroyed at the conclusion of the war or be sold to the private market. As you may recall from previous discussions, this action caused many Black families to lose their housing and left them with very few other options. To close out our discussion on realtors and real estate agents, we'll take another look at blockbusting to help prepare you for next week's discussion on installment contract sales. Blockbusting, as you may recall from episode 5, was a popular practice among real estate agents, including some realtors, despite their code of ethics that prohibited selling to a buyer who would disrupt a neighborhood's value. You may also recall from episode 5, real estate agents' blockbusting practices created race-based panic among white homeowners, causing them to sell their home and allowing the real estate agent to profit. Black buyers who purchased homes under these circumstances often bought homes with a large price markup, and, common in some localities, they purchased the home using a predatory installment contract. Blockbusting occurred across the United States and was all too common. By 1962, there were over 100 blockbusters in Chicago alone. And no, unfortunately, I don't mean the beloved video rental store. Their actions led to 15% of the census tracts in Chicago that were not already majority Black in 1950 to become majority Black. We'll dive much deeper into how next week. Blockbusting was also very common in the West. Compton, California, for instance, changed from a majority white area to a majority Black area following the use of blockbusting practices by realtors and real estate agents in the 1950s. The North experienced blockbusting as well. In Baltimore, Maryland, in the neighborhood of Edmondson Village, real estate companies purchased 2/3 of the neighborhood. In 1955, the neighborhood was nearly 100% white, but by 1965, the neighborhood was 96% Black. The average markup on these properties was 45% when the real estate companies sold the properties they acquired to Black buyers. Aside from perhaps the first few sellers who fell prey to blockbusters' fear-mongering, the homes were originally sold to the real estate companies for under market value. Thus, it's clear sellers and the ultimate buyers in Edmondson would have been much better off financially had they dealt directly with each other and not been manipulated by real estate agents. In Miami, Florida, during the wake of redlining, real estate agents decided they would make easy money by blockbusting local white neighborhoods. One man, Wesley Garrison, preyed on residents of the predominantly white neighborhood of Brownsville, instilling fear Black families were moving in and property values would fall. White residents soon fled, and Garrison in turn sold the homes to Black Americans. Today, Brownsville is still a majority-minority neighborhood, with Black Americans making up almost 49% of the neighborhood's population. Targeting Black neighborhoods to make money is not just something of the past. It still occurs across the country today. Investors are targeting Black neighborhoods and then flipping the properties for profit. In 2020, in predominantly Black Orlando neighborhoods, 30% of the homes sold were sold to investors. On the other hand, only 12% of homes were sold to investors in non-Black Orlando neighborhoods. This disparity is one of the highest in the country. This all plays into the lack of homeownership in minority communities. As we've mentioned before, lower homeownership rates equate to lower wealth accumulation, which leads to a lower rate of generational wealth for minority Americans. In short, realtors and other real estate professionals engaged in blockbusting practices to make money and put racial groups into their own segregated neighborhoods. Blockbusting practices caused white Americans to flee the neighborhoods targeted by blockbusting, and white businesses followed suit, resulting in an increase in Black unemployment and property tax disinvestment in Black neighborhoods. Eventually, blockbusting was outlawed by both the Federal Fair Housing Act and local fair housing laws, but the damage it caused to neighborhoods and Black families is still felt today. As you heard over the last couple of weeks, the policies and practices implemented by national and local real estate organizations had a significant impact on shaping and segregating our neighborhoods that contributed to a long history of discrimination against Black Americans. Real estate agents controlled the lion's share of information on available housing, and thus had the best opportunity to control who accessed that information and how it was used. These professionals also had the resources to impact policies surrounding zoning and neighborhood composition, and had connections and trust with their communities to steer public opinion. While the courts slowly took away the ability to write segregation into laws impacting communities, real estate agents found other ways to keep neighborhoods separated. Many of the consequences of those practices, which are now illegal under the Fair Housing Act, still impact our neighborhoods today. Thanks for joining us this week. We look forward to having you join us next week as we delve into the practice of installment contract sales. Until next time.